Welcome back to our course on transformational leadership, strategy, and governance. So we're focusing now on the governance issue in particular, and this module is on agile governance. So how do we create structures in our organizations that allow them to be flexible and adaptive to change quickly in the kind of complex times that we're in? And this is probably one of the biggest challenges, because we can think about culture, we can work on culture with each other, make decisions that we're going to do things in certain ways, support each other in those ways. We can work on ourselves and our own practices as leaders. But to come up with new structures and processes within our organizations is quite a challenge, particularly given that we have very few examples of how to do that from our past experience. So here's a little bit about the context and why it's important, again, for us to be working with agile governance systems. You can see at the center here is the emerging operating reality. So what does that mean? That means the context within which our organizations are acting, are operating. And that, as we've seen in many of the previous sessions, is changing very quickly. So here are a number of the elements that are impacting that operating reality. Obviously, change is moving fast. The rate of change itself is accelerating exponentially. There is increasing complexity as all these different issues come together at the same time. We're having to navigate in a very unpredictable, complex time. Hypercomplexity, you remember, was the term that came out of that IBM survey. Greater impact and frequency of extreme events, particular weather events, which we've seen a few of recently and which we're going to see a lot more of as the climate changes. Global emerging systemic risks and slow burn risks. So these risks that we saw right at the beginning on that puzzle with climate, food, water, disease, all of these different ones, some of which are moving faster and some of which are moving slower, but which are all feeding off of each other and accelerating the impact that they're having. Cultural contours with globalization, so many different cultures being forced to work together, many different contexts, clashes of different belief systems. How are we going to manage that diversity in an effective way? And then a general consciousness shift. So people being able to, starting to think differently about their reality as all of these different elements come in and confront us at this time. Our consciousness is being forced to think globally, to think more complexly about what's going on. So that creates the operating context, and our old hierarchical models where we attempt to predict the future and control our way forward are simply inadequate to that kind of operating reality. So here's a reminder of the chaotic model that we looked at before. And this is a response to that kind of operating reality. How we can create a dynamic balance between just enough structure in our systems to allow for rapid self-organization, where people really take ownership and responsibility themselves at whatever level of the organization they're in, and then are able to take initiative and stay connected to the whole and the bigger vision at the same time. So what we're going to look at now is how ubiquity has dealt with this. So when we were designing our organization right at the beginning, of course, we were familiar with all of these concepts. Myself, having had some experience in establishing and running an organization in the Netherlands that was also experimenting with these kind of approaches. We really had to think through how we're going to walk our talk. So how are we going to, knowing what we know, design and run an organization in a way that reflects these realities? So what we're going to do is just look at some of the key principles that we came up with to support us in our organizational practice, as an example of how you might go about approaching that kind of context which we just sketched. The first is alignment. We continually presence our vision, mission, and principles. So you should be familiar with this by now. The importance of staying connected to the bigger purpose of the organization that we're a part of. Because if we're all connected to that, then we can trust that people are going to do whatever they need to do to move us forward towards the vision and implement our mission. The second, dynamic steering. So in these kind of change contexts, we can't just decide where we're going to go and then plow our way forward, because as soon as we've taken the first step, things have changed. So creating a 5-year plan and trying to implement it simply doesn't work anymore. It's more like riding a bike, where we know where we need to get to, but as we move forward, we don't just kind of ride straight ahead. We're being confronted by people crossing the road, cars coming, dogs sitting on the pavement, all sorts of things going on. We have to steer our way around these things and keep moving towards our destination, but we're continually dynamically steering in the moment. So those are the kind of organizational practices we need to develop. And in that context, this reminder that we take the next natural step based on where we are now and everything we can see in the present moment and the general direction we want to do, what's the next natural step for us to take? 3, natural order. We distribute power and accountability to the most functional unit. So this has come back a couple of times in different contexts, also related to the spiral dynamics. If we are all aligned with our purpose, mission, values, then people will have natural qualities that they can bring, capacities that they can bring. And so we want to empower people wherever they are in the organization to do the things that they can do together with others to serve certain functions in the organization, to create the habitats that we were talking about that support the value systems that best match those functions. Creative tension is the 4th one. We hold tensions as sources of information. So this relates closely to the conversations we were having about how we keep our cultural field, our field of relationships clear. There's always going to be tensions, particularly when you've got a big vision. You're wanting to go somewhere. There's an instant tension between where we are now and where we want to be. And as we move forward, all sorts of tensions will come up where we'll go, well, I'm not sure if we need to do that or if this is the right thing. So rather than get ourselves stressed by the tensions, we make those tensions explicit with each other and know that that tension potentially holds information in it, holds clues for us as to what the next step is. So if we can see tensions as sources of information rather than sources of stress, then that'll help inform us as we move forward and keep us all aligned and clear in our relationships too. Diversity. We seek out a diversity of perspectives relative to the complexity of a question. So there's a couple of important points in here which we've touched on briefly in different contexts, but diversity important not just for the sake of diversity, but because the complexity that we face is directly related to the amount of diversity we need to engage that complexity. So the more complex a challenge, the more diversity we need to be able to get the information that can help us make an informed decision as we move forward. So as different challenges come at us, we ask ourselves, who needs to be part of the conversation to engage this particular challenge? What are the different perspectives that are needed? Sometimes it may just be 1 or 2 people because the complexity is low. But if the complexity is high, we may need to involve many different people and departments in the organization to make sure that we've got as much information from our dashboard as possible to take a good decision. 6, individual action. Very simple, really. We do what needs to be done. It's an important reminder to us as individuals in the organization that when we're having to make a decision, we get on and do things. If there's no guidelines, if we're in a certain context, particularly when you're in a dynamic operating environment and you're not quite sure what agreements we've made in different areas, but you've got to take a decision at that point, don't wait and send a question all the way up to the top of the organization and wait for an answer to come down. Take the action you feel needs to be taken at that moment. And then if that creates tension in the organization, then we address it. And that'll inform us as we move forward, because it was like, well, when I was in that situation, I didn't have clear guidelines as to what I needed to do. So I just need to follow my intuition and take a decision then. So that means that we may want to move ahead and create policy or guidelines for those contexts. But the important thing, particularly in these kind of contexts, is to keep moving forward, taking decisions, feeling empowered to do what we can, and then come back to the collective and see what the implications that has for our collective agreements. 7, no small one here, the principle of love. We hold it all with lightness and love. So we've touched on this before. In these kind of contexts, we mustn't take ourselves too seriously because we've got many things changing quickly. We need to be doing lots of experimentation, lots of learning, make mistakes, fail, learn from the failures, and then try again. So to hold it all lightly in a sort of experimental context, to keep our hearts open, to be compassionate for each other as we move forward, is absolutely a foundational principle to how you operate in what can otherwise be very stressful environments. So there's a sense of how we can start thinking about this question of agility in these dynamic change environments. What we're going to do over the next few sessions is look at a particular approach to governance that tries to build on some of these principles and turn it into organizational structure and governance processes.